In this video, I'll be putting the Samsung S95B of 2022 up against the S95C of 2023. These are both Samsung QD OLEDs. We're having first generation QD OLED technology up against the second generation of QD OLED technology. How much has QD OLED changed from just 1 year? We're going to find that out in this video. And can the S95B still stack up? We'll answer all of those questions in this video, and at the very end, I will try to give my best buying advice for you if you want to buy an S95B or an S95C, which one makes more sense? And if you're coming from an S95B, is it worth it to upgrade to an S95C? But first, let's talk about the actual differences in the hardware. On the S95B, all of your ports are going to be on the back of the TV like a traditional TV. On the S95C, you don't have any traditional ports on the back of the TV. Instead, you have an external One Connect box, which is this device right here. So what you do is you take this little translucent cable here and you run that all the way to the back of the S95C. Then you'll have all your ports on this box. And then you'll take your HDMI cable and you'll plug it into the back of this One Connect box like I'm doing here. And this cable right here, you can see it looks very similar to the One Connect cable. This is an HDMI 2.1 cable from today's sponsor, Rui Pro. Now this is not your average HDMI cable. This is an HDMI 2.1 fiber optic cable. If I use the HDMI 2.1 app, you can see that when you scan it, yes, it has passed all the tests. So that means it's capable of 8K 60 Hz and 4K 120 Hz. Unlike other HDMI cables, you could actually use these fiber optic cables for long distances. I actually have my Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5 in another room, and what I do is I run these cables along the wall so that I don't ever have to move my consoles. It's a really nice solution. As somebody who always is switching TVs from room to room, it's honestly made my quality of life a lot better. I've been using Rui Pro cables since 2021 when they reached out to me as a very small channel, and I want to thank them for that because these are really good cables, but you don't have to take my word for it. These cables are backed by a 5-year warranty, so if you have any problems at all, just reach out to them and they'll go ahead and take care of you. Now, I do have discount codes for these cables if you're interested in ordering them. All the information will be in the description. Thank you to Rui Pro for sponsoring this video, and thank you to you guys for listening to this segment. Now let's move on to the biggest aspect of the side-by-side picture quality. Now, the biggest change of 2023 is going to be the HDR tone mapping. Now, if you have the TV in static tone mapping, which is the more accurate mode, the realistic differences between them is not large. You're not seeing a huge jump. You might see the occasional colors are brighter on the S95C, and you also will see the colors are better in terms of skin tones, things like that. They really did clean this TV up, and I'll touch more on that a little bit later. But as far as the HDR goes, when it is in that static mode, they look fairly similar in brightness most of the time. But I do want to say, like, once you switch it into active tone mapping, well, that's when you do see a separation. With active on, the S95C does look much brighter than the S95B. Now, this won't be accurate, but it will give you more picture pop than you're used to with the S95B. So I just wanted to call that out with the differences and the changes, and you can see that throughout the whole entire video. Most of this video will be shot with the S95C in active because I want to show you the differences between the S95C and the S95B. But if you're somebody who goes for that creator's intent a little bit more, the changes are not going to be as big, but I think you'll appreciate the changes in the skin tones, which we're going to talk about right now. Now, typically, my preference is picture pop, and most of what I play and watch is going to be oriented that way. But when it comes to movies and TV shows, I do really like using filmmaker mode. Sometimes I want to follow the creator's intent, and the other times I don't. It's just my preference, and it's very much depending on what I watch. I will say that those that really do enjoy the creator's intent will like this next change, which is in skin tones. So one thing you'll notice with the S95B is they like to push a lot of red and orange, and skin tones were also looking red and orange a lot of times. This has been cleaned up a lot with the S95C, and I think that the skin tones on the S95C are just great. I don't think I have any complaints for the S95C in regards to skin tones, whether you have it on DCI-P3 color space, which is what it is default when you have auto selected, or you go into custom and switch it to BT 2020. I think the skin tones are really good. I'm a big fan of the way that BT 2020 skin tones look this year. They are a lot better than last year. They're not as red and purple as they were before. You used to have this like magenta push, and now you don't really have that with the S95C with BT 2020 on. So it is a usable thing. I think that people that are a fan of the way that this looks on their S95B will appreciate this even more on the S95C, as it has just gotten that much better. In general, when we're talking about color, it does feel like even when you're talking about things like game mode, you see the color has been toned down quite a bit out of the box. in the default modes, whereas the S95B was cranked up quite a bit. Now, I think a lot of people might think this might be a bad thing, but you can easily crank the color back up and you can make it look just like the S95B, except for with better colors. Now, I think overall, the tamer colors do lead to a better picture quality, and it's not like the colors are bland. They're not at all. They're well saturated and they look very good. I am a big fan of the S95C's colors, and I think it is definitely better color-wise than the S95B. All right, briefly, let's talk about sound, then we'll move on to the UI and menu changes, and then finish it off with my buying advice. Now, the difference in sound is quite noticeable with the S95B and the S95C. I will say that the S95C is definitely a little bit more intelligible in terms of dialogue. You can hear it a little bit clearer, but it does seem to lack a bit of bass. And I was kind of disappointed by that because when I cranked them both up to 50, I thought that the S95B gave me a real cinematic bass experience where the S95C didn't give me that. I thought that was really disappointing because the specs on the S95C speakers seem to be pretty good, and I thought that we could get a very similar experience with the S95B with just some improvements. Even if you try to crank up the bass in the equalizer, you're not getting anywhere near the bass of the S95B, so it is kind of disappointing to report that. I will say though, the S95C speakers definitely give you more of that Dolby Atmos feeling when you're watching a Dolby Atmos movie. It is more surround sound than the S95B is capable of, but in terms of just giving you the movie theater type experience, I think that the S95B is the more entertaining sound system that is in place. So that's just one thing I wanted to make sure that was clear, in my opinion. I'm definitely somebody that values bass in TV speakers as I can't really use the bigger sound systems, and I was so happy with the S95B that I felt like I didn't even need to use a soundbar. Now, you can use the Q Symphony system if you use a Samsung soundbar, which is what I would probably recommend people do if they got the S95C, just so you can add a subwoofer to it, because I do feel like you need a little bit more bass with this TV. Now, the S95B probably doesn't need that as much, but it's going to benefit from the Q Symphony. Adding on to that can improve the surround sound experience, so that's something you could look into as well. Before I get into this next segment, if you are getting value out of this video, if you could, please hit the like button and consider subscribing for future content. That would help out a lot. Thank you. All right, so let's talk about the UI changes for 2023. So Tizen OS is still in place. It is fairly similar to last year's experience, but you will notice there are new shortcuts with the menu in mind, so you can get to your sources a little bit faster. The settings menu layout is also changeable. You can move around icons as you please, so you can put the things that you want in the front and the things that you don't use that much in the back. I think that's a nice quality of life change. As far as additions to the settings go, there has been a shortcut added for Bluetooth connectivity. Instead of just being buried in the menu, you also have some changes to the expert settings regarding HDR tone mapping, so you have active and static, which we talked about a little bit earlier. For the game bar menu, you have more picture profiles available to select, and you also will see that the aim point has been added, which lets you add a crosshair to the screen. And within the game expert settings, you have new game HDR options, which is going to be what we're talking about next, because this is the biggest change in gaming for the S95C. We are going to talk about the differences in gaming. Now, I want to be clear, I will do a separate side-by-side dedicated to gaming only with these two TVs in the future, so make sure you subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss that. Alright, let's talk about the biggest changes with game mode. In the S95B, as of 1430, the game HDR toggle is going to give you less highlights than you would expect from the mode, and what I mean by that is it seems to be under tracking the highlights, and a few people have measured this to back that up. It's unfortunate because the S95B game mode was one of my favorite things last year, so I want to caution you when I say the S95C is great, nothing is guaranteed when it comes to Samsung and their TVs, so you can always get a different type of experience later on when you buy the TV depending on what the firmware actually does. So that is unfortunate because I did vouch for the S95B quite a bit when it comes to the game mode, and I still like the game mode in the S95B, but not when it's in this game HDR. Samsung tried to take game mode and make it this accurate thing, whereas before it was kind of all over the place, and a lot of people actually liked the way that looked. It did change throughout the year, but as they tried to make the TV more accurate in game mode, they did end up not doing it right, and they ended up under tracking the highlight. And as a result of that, you will get a little bit duller highlights on the S95B S95B, and I actually disable this toggle for the S95B when I'm playing in game mode. So you can still get a really good picture out of the S95B game mode if you don't use that toggle, and it's something that I personally like to use, and I put it up against the S95C, and I was kind of surprised by the results. I think the S95B held up quite well. Now, the S95C is going to give you more options than the S95B in that regard, where you have Game HDR Basic, which is going to give you close to the creator's intent, though right now it is over tracking a little bit, so that's something you want to keep in mind. You also have the Game HDR Advanced, which is going to be for those that like more of a picture pop from their game mode. I like Advanced a lot. I think that Advanced does its job quite well. You can see that when I use Game HDR Advanced, the overall HDR impact is much bigger on the S95C than the S95B. Now, there's not really a way you can replicate this on the S95B, but you can get close with a few workarounds that I'm looking into, and I'll let you know what those are once I kind of figure them out. But I think the S95C can do a little bit more than what the S95B can do in that regard. So those are the changes to the HDR game mode. The SDR game mode itself hasn't changed too much. Now, the S95C will be slightly brighter than the S95B in SDR game mode, but across the board, a lot of it is very similar, and you wouldn't need to upgrade based on that if you play a ton of SDR games like the Nintendo Switch, for example. So now let's answer a few questions. Should you buy the S95B or the S95C if you don't own either of them? Well, I think it's going to depend on what you like. I think if you really like what you see when I have the active tone mapping on, which is most of this video, then you probably will appreciate the S95C a lot more. The S95C also does look better in movies as well because of skin tones. They look a lot more natural than they did last year. The brightness and color capability of the S95C is better than the S95B as well. But again, when the TV is in static tone mapping mode, you can see that it looks fairly similar to the S95B across the board. I think the S95B does a really good job with its filmmaker mode, and people that are looking for the creator's intent probably will be fine with that. And as long as you don't have it side by side with the S95C where you can see the difference in skin tones, a lot of people will be fine with the S95B, and you can save some money and go with that. If you're a gamer, the answer is a little bit more complicated, because if you're somebody who plays in basic game mode where you have default game mode settings, contrast enhancer on high, things like that, well, if you're somebody who plays like that, then you are going to feel like the S95B and the S95C look fairly identical, and in that regard, I would just say save some money and get an S95B. If you're going to be somebody who utilizes the more advanced features with game mode HDR, then I think you'll like the S95C a lot better, and you can justify the cost maybe a little bit more in that regard. Another big question you might ask yourself is, which one gives me the best value? And I think for that, you're going to have to look at the price tags right now, which I have in the description below. Down there, you will find all of the links, and these links will be affiliate links. So if you do end up ordering a TV, if you do so ordering it with my link, it will help out the channel. So I greatly appreciate you guys if you would consider doing that. Thank you for your support. So looking at the price tag, you can see right now for the 65-inch, there's a $1,500 difference with the S95B and the S95C. So for that size, I think that the S95B is definitely going to be the better value there. The 55-inch is going to be $1,150 on the price difference, so the S95B again is the better value. But you just have to ask yourself, do you need some of the features in the S95C? Of course, if you need a 77-inch, the S95C and S90C are going to be your only options available for Samsung OLEDs. Now, let's talk about if you should upgrade if you have an S95B. And the first answer that I'm going to give everybody is going to be a big no, with the exception being jumping up in size. I don't think you should upgrade unless you are somebody who is just always looking for the cutting edge of picture quality and you just want the latest advancements in TV. You can make the S95B look fairly close to the S95C if you really try. And this is one of those cases where you don't really know what you're missing if you don't have it in front of you. And having the S95C next to the S95B, if I'm just a consumer, after seeing what I've seen, I don't think I would upgrade to the S95C unless it was fairly cheaper than it is right now. A question I ask myself is, if I had the S95B in a different room and the S95C is in another room, would I be able to tell the difference? And I think the answer is no, unless we're talking about it being an active tone mapping. Because right now, I can get away with everything that I like to do on the S95B and be just fine. I'll have a separate video where I talk about getting your S95B to look very similar to an S95C. Now, it's not going to be one for one, but I will try to make it look as close to the S95C as possible, so you're going to want to watch out for that video. And you'll be able to see that video right here once it is up. Until then, you can watch this buyer's guide on the S95B, S95C, and S90C, where I cover more details, and you can see that by clicking the video called Samsung 2023 QD OLED Buyer's Guide.